in Europe about what's going on, and in Russia as well, about where people see this war going and what different actors are doing. And some of this stuff is, quite frankly, pretty troubling, because we're going to see here some others are talking some pretty boisterous things that almost are like saying we're looking for a clash, not between Ukraine and Russia, but between NATO and Russia. And that boggles the mind even to say that's where we're heading, but that's where the evidence leads. So we're going to go down there. But first, let's start off. This is what President Trump said just hours ago at the UN General Assembly about who's actually to fault for the Russia support of this war.
China and India are the primary funders of the ongoing war by continuing to purchase Russian oil. But inexcusably, even NATO countries have not cut off much Russian energy and Russian energy products. They're funding the war against themselves. Who the hell ever heard of that one? In the event that Russia is not ready to make a deal to end the war, then the United States is fully prepared to impose a very strong round of powerful tariffs, which would stop the bloodshed, I believe, very quickly. But for those tariffs to be effective, European nations, all of you are gathered here right now, would have to join us in adopting the exact same measures.
So let's start with the back end of that one first. The last thing he just said there was that, hey, all you European nations, you guys are here too, and you're actually funding this war. He continued to say, and elsewhere, as beyond the comments there, was that he just discovered 2 weeks ago that Europe was actually buying a lot of Russian oil. That seems like an odd thing to say. What do you make of that?
Well, I thought they were buying Russian oil that came from India, and the Indians were doing a land office business, making lots of money as a result. Look, the whole thing is ridiculous. He's addressing a body, most of whom, I would say he's addressing the members of the United Nations, most of whom see Ukraine as the problem, not Russia, and see our backing of Ukraine as the problem, not Russia. So that's the first thing needs to be kept in mind. This is Joe Biden 2. This is Biden standing up, dressed up like Donald Trump with his spray tan and nice suit and red tie, telling everybody that they had better get on board with us or else. Well, they're not going to get on board with us. None of these states can be expected to move beyond the limits of their own interests. Energy is at the core of international trade. Energy is vital. Our closest allies are amongst the most foolish, and those people have now effectively deindustrialized themselves, destroyed their economies, and are facing oblivion. That's true in Germany, France, and Great Britain. The places that have not deindustrialized themselves, the people that did not throw open their borders to invasion from the Middle East and Africa and other places, and I'm talking about Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and others, they're in very good shape, frankly speaking, comparatively speaking. And I think the real message here is what Orban said to the collective Europeans and the European Union and NATO. He said, don't waste your time going to Washington. If you want to end this war, go to Moscow. And I think that's where this is all going to end. It's going to end between the Europeans and Moscow, and we will simply look ridiculous on the periphery of the whole thing. So his speech is eminently forgettable.
What do you think, though, his to the extent there is one, his intent is in making this bold declaration, which he's already done on Truth Social, and he's made the comment a couple of times, because he said this will end very quickly, if I do all of these secondary sanctions and tariffs, and everybody in Europe does it too. First of all, let's look at that, take that piece by piece. Is there plausibility that if the U.S. and Europe enforced all those secondary tariffs on China, India, Brazil, and then on top of Russia, that it would actually bring the war to an end?
No, the only thing that would occur is that they would bring their economic productivity and development to an end. China, India are going to go elsewhere to find markets for whatever they produce. They'll go to other countries that have the things they need. The big mistake here is, once again, the same one that Trump has been making ever since he took office. He thinks it's 1991. It's not. The world has moved on. No one's waiting around for Washington to catch up. So let's assume that he's successful. All the Europeans join hand in hand with us. It's sort of like we all chain ourselves together and jump in Lake Michigan together. We all drown together. They're not going to do it. Doesn't make any sense. It's not going to have the effect that he wants. It would have been much easier if he had simply said, and this would have been the easiest way for him to sort of extricate himself from the disaster. So, look, I've done all that I can do. I can't bring these parties together, but I'm no longer going to fund the war. I'm going to get out of it. I'm not going to fund it. I'm not going to support this regime any longer. But we never get that. We never get a comment from Trump that says this man Zelensky and this organized crime state that he has built, where he's got, what, $1.2, $1.5 billion in cash in various bank accounts that he's successfully pilfered and stolen from all the money that we've shipped over to Ukraine. And then talk about, the terrible position of the Ukrainian people who desperately want an end to the war, because we know they do, even though they won't publish that polling data in the West. He could have done all those things, but he's never done it. He goes back to the Biden playbook. Oh, Russia is the problem. If we can only harm Russia further, then Russia will come to the negotiating table. It's not going to work. It's failed repeatedly. But, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. That's Donald Trump. He's joined the insane club founded by his friend Joe Biden that preceded him. Well done, Joe.
Now, one has to ask, though, whether it is Biden 2.0 or Trump 1.5. I don't know, because Trump is also simultaneously with this, and a lot quieter, authorized two $500 million packages for Ukraine to include air defense missiles and long-range missiles, offensive missiles as well, with the promise that he's going to authorize up to $1 billion per month for the next 10 months for NATO to purchase to funnel onto Ukraine. But as you and I have talked about many times, our industrial capacity is not sufficient to make that much. So the only thing he can do is take it from existing stocks, which will lower our capacities further. Do you see this potentially as the intent, just to keep making money for the defense industry?
Well, I think that has to be taken into consideration. This is, I'm told by almost everybody in the administration that I talk to, that this is the most transactional administration in history. In other words, you put your money down for whatever it is that you want, and you're going to get it. I mean, they've effectively mortgaged off or sold off ambassadorships. Donate $2 million, you get to be ambassador in wherever you want to go. The same thing is true if you look at the Witkoff, Trump digital, currency exchange that is being set up that's attracted hundreds of millions of dollars of investment over in Qatar. I mean, all of this is sort of legalized grift, legalized dishonesty and deceit. I mean, I thought we were going to get past all of this, that we wouldn't be back where we were with Hunter Biden. But the more I see of this administration and the antics that are going on, all of which revolve around money, the only conclusion I can reach is that this is as corrupt as the predecessor. So I think the answer to your question is this is Biden 2. This is not Trump 1.5. The only spin that's being imparted to all of this is Donald Trump's, favorite mantra, which is, we'll sell it to you. What you do with it is your problem. Well, that's not leadership. This is not what you expect from a leader of one of the great nations if you're interested in any sort of peace coming about in the region. You would go back to what I said before. This shouldn't happen. If I had been president, it would never have happened. Remember all these speeches? Well, then, Mr. President, stop funding it, because he's not helping the Europeans. The Europeans are in serious fiscal trouble as it is. And whatever we get from these arms sales, while it may be helpful, isn't going to offset the $37 trillion national sovereign debt that we confront. So I'm tired of it. I'm just depressed, because I think a lot of us that voted for the man thought more highly of him than he deserves.
There's certainly a lot of buyer's remorse as far as that goes. I want to take one last look there about this concept of continuing to give $1 billion worth of weapons and ammunition per month, because for many of the reports that I've read, if all of the war stopped tomorrow and everything in the Middle East stopped and we're not giving anything to either Israel or to Ukraine, it would take maximizing all of our industrial capacity somewhere between 5 and 7 years to bring back up to the proper level all of our inventories of stockpiles, et cetera, for ammunition, weapons, all that kind of stuff. But those are not over. In fact, there's apparently a $6 billion arms package that's getting ready to be put down for Israel on top of all of this. What does the net do to this, to our national security capacity, and are you worried about it?
Somebody who I trust very much, who is inside the Pentagon and is intimately familiar with all of the missile arsenals or missile inventories that you're discussing, and various other kinds of rocket weapons, says 8 to 10 years to recover unless we are very efficient. Of course, that's a huge, statement. If we're very efficient, we can rebound in 5 to 7 years. But he thinks that's unlikely because of all the different defense contractors, the different weapon systems, and Congress's constant meddling in the defense budget to ensure that they and their donors and constituents all get a share of the budget. So I think it's probably closer to 8 to 10 years than 5 to 7. But it may be that Donald Trump is making a mistake of assuming that we are invincible and vulnerable, that no one is really going to challenge us. And I think that's a mistake. If you look at the Saudi Arabian, Pakistani,
NATO stepped up. When they went from 2% to 5%, that was great unity.
Sorry, we apparently have breaking news here.
And they're paying us for the weapons that we send. But that was a big day. That nobody thought a thing like that could happen. You had countries that weren't paying 2%, and now they're all paying 5%. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of weapons they're buying, and they're buying them from us. They're buying them from the U.S. In the old days, Biden gave them everything, gave them $350 billion worth of money and weapons. That's a lot of money and a lot of weapons, and we got really not much for it. We gave the money to Ukraine to fight, and they've proven they're very brave. I mean, look, they're fighting, and this is a war going on 3.5 years, and people thought it would be over quickly because Russia's a big military power, and Ukraine, I tell you, they are good fighters. Got to hand it to them. They have a lot of courage, a lot of guts. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you. That his common themes there is that, look, Biden just gave all this money, with his weapons away, but we're selling it, so we're actually making money. But just before that, we went to that break there. You were saying like the most likely case is not 5 to 7, but maybe 6 to 8 years, and that's once it stops. But it hasn't stopped yet. Now we're still giving it away, so that would seem that it's only going to continue to erode our capabilities. However much longer this goes in, do you worry about that if we should get sucked into a war?
Well, that was the point I was trying to make, that the world has changed, and the weapon systems that can destroy us are on display in Russia right now, being used against Ukrainians. These weapons are proliferating. In other words, they're finding a home in other countries. And one of those, of course, is China, that has the largest manufacturing base in the world, and certainly the largest manufacturing base in the world devoted to military production. So the point is that he's essentially saying, look, I blackmailed our allies, and now they're paying up. Well, 5% from Bulgaria isn't a lot. 5% from Romania isn't a lot. 5% from Latvia or Finland is not a lot. In other words, we've got to be reasonable. And you're talking about uneven sums of money, uneven investments. There is no unity of effort. There is no unity of command in NATO. Purchases, buys, yes, most of it is going to be American military equipment, which is a great triumph, especially since we've seen a lot of evidence that our equipment doesn't perform very well. But of course, they're probably looking primarily at missiles and radars. Our radars are excellent, and I think most of our missiles are pretty good. But the whole thing is ridiculous. And what I was going to try and say about Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, if you look at this pact that they've got with China, that is pregnant with meaning. All sorts of things are going on with that. But the one thing you've got to keep in mind is that the Chinese will provide state-of-the-art missile technology, radar technology to both Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, and they will be paid handsomely in gold for it. And they're not the only ones. The Egyptians have conducted combined exercises with the Chinese, as the Iranians have, and the Chinese are providing some of the same technology to the Egyptians. So within the next few months, I suspect that you will see state-of-the-art missile batteries in Egypt that the Israelis can't cope with. And I think you're going to see the same thing happen in Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't be surprised if something similar happened in Turkey. In other words, China is changing the military balance in the region. And that change in that balance is something we cannot easily redress because they can outproduce us. And they're not alone. And they've had brilliant testing grounds called Ukraine. So they found out exactly what does and doesn't work. Bottom line is that that's the tip of the proverbial iceberg. That's also part of a change in the entire global economy where everybody is running away from the dollar. The dollar is plunging in value. We're debasing the currency. People are offloading it. The Chinese are offloading more treasuries. Everybody is trying to get rid of the dollar, which they see as a menace. They also see it as a weapon that can be used against them. They look at what we did to Russia. Well, we told the Russians, you're not going to have access to anything in the West anymore. We're cutting you out of SWIFT, and we're going to steal $300 billion of your money. So everybody looked at this and said, well, gee, then we need to find an alternative. And guess what? Yeah. They have an alternative, and that alternative is developing rapidly. China is at the heart of this thing. China is going to open gold vaults in Riyadh as well as in Hong Kong. What are these gold vaults for? They're almost warehouses. For instance, if the Chinese buy X amount of oil from the Saudis, for instance, the Saudis will be paid in gold. If the Saudis buy technology from China, the Chinese will be paid in gold. In other words, the yuan, which is their currency, is now gold backed. That's why they have been acquiring and hoarding as much gold as possible. I don't know what we have for gold holdings. I'm suspicious of any claims whatsoever. I hope we have at least half of what we claim. I just don't know. But the point is, this is a world in which right now we can't compete. So the de-dollarization goes hand in hand with the delivery of lethal missile technology to places like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, Turkey. And all of these states are aligned against Israel. So this is a big deal. That has to be viewed against the backdrop of what's already happened in Europe. NATO is disintegrating. This is not some strong, cohesive alliance, far from it. And the three principal allies, I call them the three amigos, London, Paris, and Berlin, are in bad shape. Their Lilliputian armies can't fight anybody. They're certainly not up to confront the battle-hardened Russian military establishment that is straightened out whatever was wrong and is now doing better than ever. So he's kind of in a fantasy world. He doesn't I assume he understands, but perhaps he doesn't understand what's happening to us economically, the debasement of our currency, the de-dollarization, and the destination for us is default. The sooner we do it, the better. But I don't think we're going to do it at all. I think we're just going to grind ourselves down to nothing, which I think is probably the preferred outcome for Wall Street. But it's disastrous for us people.
Yeah, you say you don't know that he knows. He started off his UN speech today by talking about how the United States was the hottest country in the world, and we have the greatest economy by far. We have the greatest military by far. We produce more than everybody else. Sometimes you think, well, that's just him bloviating like he does. But then you have to ask, maybe he actually believes that, because if he's basing actions on that belief, then, as you say, we could be in a world of hurt. Now, you mentioned something about NATO, and I want to pivot there, because there's also things happening off the headlines there that are very important, probably should be on the headlines. And that is, here of late, there's been a lot of claims that Russia has been violating the airspace of Poland and Estonia, and since June, Romania, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. And so now all of a sudden, there's been a lot of alarm that's saying, all right, no more. We're going to have this Eastern Shield that NATO is going to put up there. We're going to use lots of additional alliance firepower to protect against what may come from Russia. And then now the verbal parts are starting to get heated up as well. And I want to start first of all with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who's saying, if necessary, we'll shoot down Russian jets.
If necessary, yes, we will shoot down the plane. or, of course, we already shot down a drone, if necessary. And this exactly comes back to what I just mentioned, that we will always assess the situation, assess the immediate threat the plane poses, and acting quickly and decisively is exactly what happened in these two cases. And I'm really proud of our fighter jet pilots doing this, and our commanders in contact with them, coordinating all these activities. Clearly, what the Russians are doing is not acceptable. If it is intentional or not, at least it is reckless. And it should stop, absolutely. And what they will see now over the last couple of weeks is that whatever happens, we are there. And it will not, as you've seen in the next statement, detract us from supporting Ukraine, if that is what they might be thinking they could achieve. I don't know what is in their minds. If it was intentional, again, we are still assessing that. We will also keep on supporting Ukraine with even more vigor and more determination.
Doug, let's look at first of all, the initial claim that Russia intentionally violated the airspace of Poland with allegedly 19 drones, but so far only a few grainy photographs have been produced at all, and certainly not any evidence. And there's a lot of potential that this wasn't even real at all, that it was something manufactured by the Western side to just cast Russia in a bad light, who themselves said that, no, we did not send any drones into Poland. What do you make of what actually happened at the core of that?
Well, first, let's admit that Rutte's words were bravely spoken. He sounds like a man who is defiantly shaking his fist at the enemies of mankind and sort of reminding everybody that this fight will go on until evil has been vanquished. It's a lot of nonsense. It's horse dung. We've looked at this, and NATO looked at this. I'm talking about NATO headquarters and the military headquarters in Mons have looked at this whole allegation. The first thing that NATO concluded and said publicly was this was not an attack on NATO. Okay. Ruled it out right off the bat. Well, if it's not an attack, what is it? Is it something along the lines that you described? Is this Ukrainians capturing electronically some of these unmanned aerial vehicles and directing them towards Poland? I have no idea. Did someone in Norway up near the Arctic Circle sight a Russian unmanned aerial vehicle on the edge of the air defense identification zone and conclude that it had strayed into their airspace? I have no idea. I do know that the jets that were launched didn't seem to have much success against these targets in the air because less than 20% of them were struck. And I know from someone on the ground in Poland who checked it carefully that the debris that fell on a house in central Poland was not from an unmanned aerial vehicle. It seems to have come from an unexploded munition launched by one of the jets. I think the whole thing is hot air. It's nonsense. But what's depressing about the whole thing is that this is one more last gasp as an effort to drag us, the United States, into a war with Russia, because that's what it's all about. These are little nations. They have armed forces. The Polish army, by the way, is very, very good. It's probably better than the other three armies, German, French, and British. But it's too small to make a dent. About the only thing they can do is deploy another 10 or 15,000 troops to the border with Belarus or Ukraine. But to launch a major operation, an offensive on the ground, they don't have the depth, they don't have the experience, they don't have the organizational construct to support it. All of this is just hot air. And I think it's getting hotter by the day because the position of the globalists who've been running the show in Europe is eroding very, very rapidly. The three amigos are all going to go down. They're not going to survive. And this Polish president, President Nawrocki, had better read the tea leaves, because the only intelligent thing he said since he became president was his announcement that under no circumstances would any Polish soldiers fight in Ukraine against Russia. And he noted that roughly 10,000 Poles were killed inside Ukrainian uniform for fighting against the Russians. Nobody has an appetite for that in Europe at all. So Rutte is full of hot air, but he's also dangerous because he creates the illusion that there's some readiness for war which doesn't exist. And this could easily result in an accident. Somebody somewhere along the line of contact, which is the eastern front of NATO, could suddenly come into contact accidentally with something that's Russian, and you have an incident, and the whole thing erupts into an all-out war. I mean, I hope not. So I think the rhetoric needs to cool off because it's all nonsense. It's not going to happen.
Well, if you talk about the rhetoric needing to cool off, it went in the opposite direction when it was the Polish foreign minister, Sikorski, who addressed the United Nations Security Council conference a couple of days ago, pointedly looked at his Russian counterpart and said, "You have been warned."
By signing the Hitler-Stalin Pact, you helped launch World War II, the bloodiest in history. By Sovietizing Central Europe, you caused the Cold War. Don't start another one. We are peaceful democracies who have studiously avoided actively joining your attempt to reconquer Ukraine. But we will not be intimidated. I have only one request to the Russian government. If another missile or aircraft enters our space without permission, deliberately or by mistake, and gets shot down and the wreckage falls on NATO territory, please don't come here to whine about it. You have been warned.
What do you make of that? That you have been warned? I mean, he seems pretty cocky.
It sounds like Anne Applebaum wrote those remarks for him. That's his wife, and she is a card-carrying globalist / neocon, sort of the modern equivalent of a Bolshevik. And she and Jack Keane, I'm sure, would like to get together with Sikorski and plan the next war. Now, on the positive side, I was delighted that he at least told the truth about the Second World War. Without Stalin and communism, you don't get a war. Without communism, there's no National Socialism. I mean, the chicken and the egg issue needs to be understood. And Stalin was quite happy to see the war launched by Germany against France and Great Britain because he thought, much as FDR, by the way, that this would be another exercise in trench warfare and drag on and on and on. He hoped that it would grind down Germany so that he could strike from the east and overwhelm Germany, and the Allies would be stuck. And so we would make lots of money selling the Allies everything from spare parts, weapons, munitions, and food to the people in the field. So both FDR and Stalin miscalculated. The war was over in a month. They thought it was going to last for at least a year. But I'm glad to hear he mentioned that. But having said that, everything else is pure, unadulterated nonsense. You are warned. I'm sure everybody in Moscow is shaking in their boots. You know, what a ridiculous statement to make. But this is the sort of war rhetoric that you get out of these people. There is no comprehension of what they are talking about. Whatever they saw between 1941 and 1945 would shrink to insignificance next to the destruction and the loss of life that would ensue if these fools carried out their stated intention of provoking the Russians into a war. That's how serious this is.
Well, and that didn't seem to be lost on the Russians because Ambassador Sikorski on the other side of that circle there, he also talked about the if not the origins, the consequences of World War II and what Russia did.
Tusk today recognized that not a single drone that was found contained explosives. Not a single one posed a threat to civilians. As for the Polish opposition, it clearly said this is a blatant provocation, the aim being to pull Poland into war. Primitive hatred for our country and an attempt to portray Russia as the main threat to pan-European security is, before our very eyes, becoming the only ideology of European states. They're trying their utmost to make the next generation forget the bitter experience of predecessors of today's Euro-integrators. For instance, the experience of Napoleon and Hitler, who suffered defeat at our country's hands, for which Europe paid a lengthy and painful price.
So if this is just a kind of a, he said, she said, and then one can be sounding cocky, then the other can sound cocky, which side has the ability to back up the words?
Russia. Russia has a battle-hardened military establishment. They've absolutely embraced the new paradigm, which is connecting ISR to strike systems and making it impossible for your enemy to move, to think, to do anything, and then using the maneuver forces they've got on the ground to exploit what the ISR strike creates in terms of opportunities on the battlefield. They've done that. We're a long way from that. We can get there. We have the technology, but we aren't thinking in those terms right now. The Europeans are woefully behind. So, again, this is all empty rhetoric. It is dangerous, though, for the reason that I mentioned earlier. These stupid, pointless statements designed to create the illusion of strength where there is none invites a response. And that's something we don't want. No one in their right mind wants a war with Russia. And the Russians certainly don't want a war with the West. If they were hell-bent for a war with the West, they'd have been on the Polish border a year and a half ago at the least. But they weren't interested in that. They're already sitting on most of the terrain that was historically Russian with a Russian population. They are willing to do business and come to an end of this thing, but they're not going to accept this sort of clownish neo-Nazi government in Kiev. They're not going to allow Ukraine to be a springboard for Western attack against Russia. So this is what Donald Trump listened to in Alaska and decided to ignore. And that's why nothing's happened. And I think President Putin and everybody in Moscow have said there's nothing, we have no choice. We have to go forward and achieve our ultimate aims. Now, again, the good news for them is the situation in Europe is changing much more quickly than it is here. And remember, these are parliamentary governments. I was talking earlier today to a German. He said, "Oh, this is a terrible government we have. It could be 4 or 5 years, given our system before we get rid of it." I said, "That's not true. All you need is a no confidence vote. And the worse things get, the more frequent that's likely to be. So the sooner it happens, the better for you." He said, "Oh, yeah, that would be great if we could do it." It's interesting. The Europeans really can change things quickly. They can throw out these people and put in new governments very, very rapidly. They can't fix everything else, the financial situation, quickly, but they can certainly end this travesty of this stupidity in Ukraine and start spending the money at home where they need it. That's why you've got 800,000 people on the streets in London and several 100,000 people on the streets in Paris. And eventually you're going to see the same thing in Germany, because nobody wants anything to do with this. But, remember, Rutte and Merz and Starmer and Macron, they are part of the graduating class of globalists that are determined to force the world into something it doesn't want. A world without borders, a world without effective management of its own economy, a world without industry and scientific development, a world of poverty and despair with a small ruling elite consisting of themselves telling everybody else how to live, a surveillance state where they're in charge and no one else is. All of this has got to go away. It will.
And to your point, I mean, we just saw a vote of no confidence in Paris just less than a month ago. So that obviously is something that could happen at any time, and Germany's moving in that direction. One of the things that may not help or may actually exacerbate some of these things is that the Russian view on this, they've been, pretty famously have the patience of Job about how they've not responded to a lot of things. But one wonders if there's a limit to the Russian patience. Dmitry Peskov, the statement for the spokesman for the Kremlin, said this morning that, look, we got to recognize, or we do recognize, we're effectively already at war with NATO.
NATO is fighting with Russia. This is obvious and needs no additional proof. NATO is de facto involved in this war. NATO is providing direct and indirect support to the Kiev regime. This is why it can be said with absolute certainty that NATO is fighting against Russia.
And I'm sorry, that was actually a week ago. That's not the comment he made this morning. But obviously, it's still the statement for the way the Kremlin sees this. Is he being hyperbolic, or NATO is helping the Ukraine side, but he says direct and indirect?
No, I think it's very accurate. And again, this goes back to, are we dealing with Trump 2 or Biden 2? And my view is that if you're looking at the situation in Ukraine or the Middle East, it's Biden 2. Whatever President Trump promised, whatever he argued for, whatever he supported before he was elected, has been completely displaced by Biden policies. In fact, you could argue that he's doubled down on all the failed policies and made matters that much worse. So the opportunity for normalization of relations with Moscow, which he said is something that he really wanted back in January and February, has vanished. There's no longer any interest in it. It's very sad. So you have to conclude, yes, this is NATO, but remember, without the United States, NATO doesn't amount to much. That's the bottom line. And if we're selling to the Europeans sophisticated missiles and other technologies of the military, the Russians aren't fooled. They know where it's coming from and they know who's supporting it. So he's effectively correct. Now, your question is, if you're a Russian, how long do you put up with this? Well, there are two answers. One is they've won militarily on the ground, and there is no rush at this point. There's no reason to cross the Dnieper and overrun Western Ukraine. They don't want to do it. They want to sort that out another way. On the other hand, there are undoubtedly voices in Moscow warning this could get a lot worse if we don't stop it now. So I don't know which side you fall down on in Moscow. I think President Putin has exercised restraint and patience, and it's paid off. And it's going to pay off handsomely over the next 6 months, because I think that's going to be the end of the globalist regimes in the West. When they're gone and the nationalists take over, that's when you get peace in Ukraine, because they're not going to go to war. And that, again, is why Orban was saying just very recently, don't waste your time going to Washington. Washington isn't going to solve our problems. Washington has no interest in solving our problem being the war in eastern Ukraine. Look at Trump. Look what he's doing. We got to go to Moscow. Moscow is just as interested in an end to this thing as we are. And the Europeans really are interested in it, not necessarily the globalists, because the day that they no longer fight, the day that they admit that this thing can end and that they were wrong to begin with, they had no business, supporting this regime and encouraging the worst aspects of it in a war, they're finished. They're going to have to be removed before anybody admits that, I'm afraid.
Well, you mentioned a minute ago that if Jack Keane had his way, it turns out that he is lobbying for a way. And now he's not in the administration, but he's obviously a very influential person, definitely a part of this so-called elite that loves war and has been advocating for a continuation of this. But he actually said, and I'm wondering to what extent you think this plays into the Putin calculation for how much longer patience is in order, or should they escalate and ramp things up? Because Jack Keane this morning was referring, first of all, to something happened in Poland when this alleged penetration happened with the drones, and they activated Article 4. He went on television this morning and said, maybe we should be looking at Article 5.
They want Poland to conclude that what they need to do is shore up their defenses better and reduce the resources and support for Ukraine, because they're threatening them. Oh. And it's not a hybrid war. These are conventional tactics being used. Russia has the capability to deliver 1,000 drones flying into Ukrainian airspace and into Polish airspace. And it's a fact that Poland would not be able to stop all those drones based on the interceptors that they have and the $1 million interceptors that they are to shoot down a $10,000 drone that has the capability of killing people. Wake up. This is not a hybrid war. This is Russia testing you, and the next step could be quite something significant. And NATO has got to come together and not talk about Article 4, talk about Article 5.
What the hell, man? Article 5, I mean, that's like saying, let's get ready to go to war with Russia. And he's actually saying that we need to be worried about Russia attacking us. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, that's ridiculous. But let's go back to something he said, which is a very important insight. He said, let's face it, the Russians could launch 1,000 unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, armed and otherwise, into Poland. He's right. They could. And Poland can't possibly shoot them down. He's right. They can't. So if that's in fact true, why the hell are you talking about going to war? I mean, what a dumb idea. If you're already telling everybody that there's a capability gap and the Russians hold the high ground, they have escalation dominance, why would you want to risk a war? It makes no sense at all. The other thing is we got to go back to this Article 5, and if you read it carefully in the NATO treaty, Article 5 does not result in an automatic commitment to conflict against anybody. It commits everybody to have a meeting, after which the various national representatives have to go back to their respective countries, and their respective parliaments have to vote on whether or not they will fight. That's all. So this notion that Article 5 is a silver bullet and it commits everybody to automatic conflict, which apparently is something that General Keane and Petraeus and everybody else would like to see, is simply inaccurate, and it's wrong. I think there should be one more comment that he should reinforce if he gets a chance to tell the American people anything. And that is that all of these intercontinental ballistic missiles that exist in the Russian arsenal, a few now in China and ours for that matter, but we're worried about the ones in Russia, frankly. They are hypersonic. We can't shoot them down. So you're living in an event, in a setting where if you push this envelope and you insist on escalation, the escalation you get will be terminal because you can't shoot it down. It's sort of the same comment about Poland, only we're elevating it now to an intercontinental level. I mean, these things need to be stated. If people understand this, they will draw back in horror. And they will say, wait a minute, what does this general want? What's he arguing for? This man's lost his mind. Nobody will vote for that. Nobody wants that. Nobody supports that. And that's really what's at the heart of this. You don't go into a conflict without some relative confidence that you can win it. If you can't win it, avoid it. And then get to work to build yourself up to the point where if it should ever happen in the future, you could respond with some measure of confidence. We did that. That's the Cold War. We did that, certainly from the 50s all the way up into the late 80s. But do we need to do that now? That's the question. The Russians have had plenty of opportunity to inflict enormous damage, and they have not done it. They have done everything in their power to contain this conflict and keep it in eastern Ukraine. They have only struck west of the river because they had to weaken the logistical infrastructure, the productivity, and the manpower pool. So wake up. All these people need to go away. We need to replace all of them immediately because war is the last thing we need in Europe. It would finish Western civilization forever.
It would, but I just guess, especially, the likes of Jack Keane, the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, huge money is made a lot of this on this, whole ramping up. I mean, he literally would lose money, and all of these folks that you talk about, this global elite, I mean, they would lose money if we went into a position of peace. And unfortunately, they seem to hold so much sway, even though what they say is irrational and many times just flat out illogical. And yet they still keep getting the mic put in front of their press. Is there any way to bypass that to get to the sanity that most people, I think, recognize?
It's very hard in Europe right now, particularly in Germany, France, and Great Britain, to express an opinion that contradicts conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is the narrative spun up by MI6 and CIA or Mossad, and then launched day in and day out every day to Germans and Frenchmen and Britons, telling them that they live in this very dangerous environment, and the only answer to it is to provoke a war. I mean, literally. You've got it. All you can do is say exactly what I did. Remember, we have this study that was done by NATO last year, and I think it was quoted in RUSI in London, and it said that NATO can only protect roughly 5% of its territory from air and missile attack. Well, that situation hasn't changed. You got to go back and look at a different world that existed in 1942, 43, 44, and 45, when we and the British, because the Russians weren't involved in it, the massive air campaign of bombing of Germany, we lost 18,000 bombers. And that was to a far less sophisticated air defense, but the Germans made the most of what they had, and it was very lethal. We lost, more men in the, the 8th Air Force than we lost in the entire Marine Corps during World War II. How did we lose them? We lost them trying to penetrate German air defenses. Those losses, that kind of human sacrifice, as well as materiel loss, has to be understood, because it will happen on steroids today, because technology is raced ahead and our vulnerability is greater now than it ever was then. But, it's hard to make that argument in Europe because they never hear it.
Right. Yeah. And I think so few would just don't believe it because, well, it's still 1991, like you said a minute ago, in their minds, and hard to disabuse them of that. In the amount of time we have left here, I want to ask your thoughts on one other thing the president said, and that has to do with Iran. Now, he prefaced his comments here. I mentioned part of it at the first by saying that the United States is the greatest country and the greatest military, the greatest economy that's ever happened, and we're better than everyone, bar none. And then he also said that I've solved 7 wars, and so I'm really good at solving wars. The 30 years it took, this one, 31 years, that one. So no matter how complicated they are, I'm really good at it. And then he talks about Iran and his more than his comments here about what he thinks should happen. Notice what he says about how we got to this so-called 12-day war.
I extended a pledge of full cooperation in exchange for a suspension of Iran's nuclear program. The regime's answer was to continue their constant threats to their neighbors and U.S. interests throughout the region, and some great countries that are right nearby. Today, many of Iran's former military commanders, in fact, I can say almost all of them, are no longer with us. They're dead. And 3 months ago, in Operation Midnight Hammer, 7 American B-2 bombers dropped the 14 30,000-pound each bombs on Iran's key nuclear facilities, totally obliterating everything. But we did something that for 22 years people wanted to do.
Okay, first of all, he says we gave them every chance for negotiation, but we were in negotiations. They were willing to have it. There was a next round set, and then we went in and blew up these facilities, and it's very debatable whether we actually destroyed them, obliterated them, as he claimed here. But, I mean, this kind of undercuts the very claim that we want to have a negotiated settlement when we already blew up their country in the midst of negotiations. What do you think of that?
P.T. Barnum said another sucker is born every 10 minutes. I think he tends to regard Americans and everybody else as a sucker, that he can stand up there, make these outrageous claims, and be believed. Remember, the man is a marketing genius. That's what created his success in New York City in the real estate game. That's why he did so well on reality TV. He's very good at creating and cultivating an image. The fact that it has no basis in reality doesn't matter in most cases. But things are changing now, Dan. Things are changing here in the United States and over in Europe. The average American is looking at a very grim prospect right now economically. You just saw all these job numbers revised, a reduction of something like 980,000 jobs from what was originally published. I mean, Americans know the truth because they're living it. The only thing that hasn't hit us yet really very hard is energy, but that's coming. You can't just grandstand your way out of these things. And he's always revised the truth to suit himself. And that's not unique to him. Politicians everywhere have a habit of doing that to some extent. But this has gotten old, At least when Muhammad Ali told everybody he was the greatest, you watched him box and you knew damn right he was.
Right.
This is nonsense. But for the moment, it will continue to be tolerated for all sorts of reasons. Various special interests are invested in him, and they're going to stay invested in him. So you turn this whole thing in the Middle East around and create the impression that our great friend and America's greatest ally, Israel, is the helpless victim. And whatever they do is inherently defensive in nature, and therefore we must support them. Okay, good luck with that, because nobody in the region believes that. In fact, most of the world doesn't buy that argument.
Yeah, in fact, Erdogan, in his comments this morning, was pretty adamant about calling out the reality of that, and many people see the same thing here. But sticking with the Iran, there's potentially some flashpoints coming up pretty soon because Trump is still saying he wants to have a negotiated settlement with them, though he hasn't got a good diplomatic track record with them to even start something like that. But if the Europeans say, okay, snapback sanctions are coming, et cetera, where do you see this conflict with Iran going? Is it just something that's going to fester on for a while, or is it possible to get back to a hot combat zone again?
Oh, I think the war will be resumed. Because if you're Netanyahu and the goals that you've established, the objectives that you've got, necessitate that Iran looks something like Syria, and that the whole region be permanently intimidated into unquestioning subordination and obedience to Greater Israel. So he's got to go to war again. So I would look for an incident of some kind that becomes the basis for justifying an Israeli assault on Iran. I think something will happen. The bad news for Israel is that Iran has dramatically strengthened itself. Its air defenses and its arsenal of missiles are both in better shape now than they were when the 12-day conflict occurred. Much, much better. And I think there's a danger of more people becoming interested in the outcome of the conflict, including people outside of the Middle East. I hope it doesn't happen, but I think it has to happen for him to achieve his aims.
Well, that's not a good thing, especially if the United States seems to just be reflexively supporting whatever Netanyahu says, no matter how negative it is for our national interest. That probably won't be good for us, but I guess we'll have to wait and see how that develops. But in any case, we really appreciate you coming on.